Strap on your boots, roll up your socks, and remember where you put your mouthguard. It's time to talk footy. This is Selling the Dummy, the AFL discussion show on Bizz 99.9 FM Substitute Radio. I'm your host Chukka Wilson. Among other things, I am Bizz 99.9 FM's Managing Director of Sports Production. I'm joined by one of the most esteemed intellectuals in the football commentariat. He's a brilliantly insightful radio commentator. He's an internationally syndicated columnist. He's been appearing on our TVs every Sunday morning for as long as any of us can remember. He's Shane Scooter Coots. Welcome to the program, Scooter.
G'day Chukka, hope you've been well.
I have been well. So, last year, we wrapped up Selling the Dummy in September, in the middle of the final season. So, in this episode, we're going to be covering the remainder of the 2017 AFL season that we missed, plus everything that's happened over the 2017-18 summer, because round one of the AFL is just around the corner, and we've got to prepare for it. So, stick around, because there's lots to talk about. And welcome back. You're listening to Selling the Dummy on Bizz 99.9 FM Substitute Radio. I'm Chukka Wilson and I'm joined by Shane Scooter Coots. Now, Scooter, last year in the 2017 AFL season, we had some very good on-field football. It seems as though those problems that we had a few seasons ago with rule differences and unfair play seems to have disappeared, and it seems like all the problems have been sorted out, everything's been smoothed out, and we've got really good on-field football last season, and there's no reason why we shouldn't see it this season because there hasn't been any rule changes.
Yeah, it's kept it very similar there, and I think we're starting to break through that passage of the game there. What we notice from time to time is that there might be a slight change in what the better teams are doing structurally there, and in the more recent times we've got a very organised Hawthorn side who have been very disciplined with their structures there. But slowly we've started seeing teams go back to what was dominant about 15 years ago. Perfect example is the Brisbane Lion team of the 2001 to 2003 years. Winning the contested ball, forcing it forward there, and kicking it to, say, one or two targets there, and having clever forwards there to crumb the ball there. So it's come a lot more about that contested ball, which the fans love to see there. So the field is in a good state. There's a good mixture of the higher or lower scoring games as well. I think it's important to have both of those, and both of those are occurring, especially last season.
And as far as the off-field stuff is concerned, as far as the AFL as a brand, a commercial icon, it's going very well as well, because over the course of the 2017-18 summer, there were lots of crises all across the world affecting all sorts of institutions in society, from sex scandals to corporate tax dodging. There's so much chaos that's been building up across society, and the AFL has not been touched by any of this, which suggests either they're very good at keeping the skeletons in their closet, or their actual hands are clean, and they actually are very good at preserving a certain credibility as far as the AFL brand is concerned, and actually being rather living up to their ideals of integrity and honour, which suggests that the AFL is a trustworthy brand.
Yeah, it's been a little bit tame for an off-season since about, say, October there, when you expect things to die down. As it happened, the cricket had the Ashes series, and so AFL would have been hoping to take a back seat there to allow cricket to have the spotlight, and that seemed to occur for the majority of it there. It has been very well run there. All the news that came out of the off-season was either positive or with interest there. Think about the expansion of the AFLW competition there, the introduction of AFLX. All of it's either a positive state, or it's giving it a go, seeing if the fans will like it there. It's trying to expand the game to not only across Australia, but across the world as well there. So they're moving in the right direction there, the AFL.
Okay, so we ended our Selling the Dummy season last year with the conclusion of round one of the final series, which is the first round, which is the qualifying finals. And so we've got to look at the remaining 5 games that happened over the final series in 2017. 2017. So the first of all, we've got the second semi-finals, which are in week 2. So Geelong absolutely thumping Sydney, and then GWS absolutely walloping West Coast.
This is actually a really important final series for the AFL for a couple of reasons, and the first one actually involves this week of the final series. From 2016, it was actually the first year where there was the bye before the final series there, and the Bulldogs happened to come from bottom half of the top 8 to win the premiership there. And so what the thought process was for the fans is that this week off is giving too much an advantage to the sides finishing 5th to 8th. So what the AFL may not necessarily been hoping for, but what would have helped justify the decision, is if both of the finalists who finished in the top 4 playing in this round won through. And it actually happened there. So it actually worked well for the AFL from that perspective. Geelong were just too good for Sydney. They were too hard at the ball there. Sydney were really rampant against Essendon, probably even a little bit too easy there. Essendon weren't really up to scratch there in that first week, as we talked about last time, and Geelong were really up to the challenge there. They got thumped themselves by Richmond there, and so had a point to prove there. Dangerfield was fantastic, as you expect him. You wouldn't expect him to play 2 lower games in a row there, and Sydney just didn't have the firepower. You can't win the game with 39. That's just the simple truth of it all. Up to spotless staying with GWS, well, they actually finished quite strongly, and it was also an important game for Steve Johnson there. Was not necessarily guaranteed a spot in the side there. You got guys like De Boer and Green there playing well, so he really had to make sure he earned his spot in the side there, and he was fantastic in that particular game there. As for West Coast, most thought they played their grand final the week before, and that extra time win over Port Adelaide, so it actually wasn't a shock that they got beaten there today in what was the final game for Matt Priddis and Sam Mitchell.
And then we move on to the week 3, which is the preliminary finals, and we saw the two teams that were coming back from their week off to actually play this, and they both won. So first of all, Adelaide defeated Geelong 136-75, and then Richmond defeated GWS 103-67. So the two teams that had the rest off in round 2 come back and they win, and they get into the grand final. And so the two teams that had won in week 2, Geelong and GWS, were kicked out.
Well, exactly right there, and this part wasn't as surprising there, considering that Adelaide themselves getting the home final there, a really powerful side at home there, and 136 is a massive score there, considering how well their forward line was working with the likes of Betts, with the likes of Walker, Tom Lynch as well there. So no surprise they kicked a big score there. Geelong 75 wasn't necessarily the worst from their perspective there. Of course, a few of their goals were after the horse had bolted there. So one of the things that Geelong had to make sure that they thought about for next season after the game was how they could shore up their backline. Unfortunately, actually worked the other way there. We'll mention them with guys like Andrew Mackie and Tom Lonergan retiring there. It means they're going to have to plug some holes in their backline for the 2018 season, and they weren't able to stop Adelaide. As for Richmond and West Sydney there, it was a little bit emotional. Brett DeLeo for the first time playing against his old side there for GWS, and it was also one of their rare trips to the MCG there. And for a lot of it, they were in the contest there. It was probably more about the third quarter where Richmond started pulling away there. Otherwise, they were keeping up with the pace there. It was also hard for GWS because it was probably one of the most one-sided crowds you could imagine there. We got 90,000 at the MCG, and you probably wouldn't find more than 100 supporting the Orange and Charcoal there. So massive support for Richmond there. The decibels were actually compared with some things like a jet taking off there. That's how loud the noise was. It was a fantastic atmosphere. No surprise Richmond ended up winning that game.
And so we come to the grand final, and we had a very unique and very special circumstance where the two teams that were competing for the premiership both had not won a premiership in the last 20 years and hadn't been in a grand final in at least the last 20 years. Adelaide won a premiership in the 90s, and Richmond hadn't won in a couple of generations. And so this meant that no matter what happened, we were going to have a new chapter of the AFL written, which we weren't certain of last year, the 2016 season, because we had the Western Bulldogs, who obviously hadn't been in a grand final for a very long time and had won a premiership for a very long time, but they were playing against Sydney, who had a very long streak of premierships and grand finals in very recent memory. And so there was an uncertainty about what would happen. But this time, there was a certain bit of relaxation because it didn't really matter who won. A new chapter would be written either way. And it ended up being Richmond winning very comfortably against Adelaide to win their second premiership in their entire history.
Yeah, it was an interesting one. From a neutral perspective, yeah, you're exactly right there. Both sides had their reasons for being the supporters of the neutral there. You've got Adelaide, for example, they lost their coach before their current coach Don Pike there, and that was of course hard to go through at the time there, and they've actually bounced back terrifically well. We can't underestimate how hard it was for Adelaide to get back to where they were, actually making their first grand final since 98, like you talked about there. And as for Richmond, well, with such a rich history prior to 19 1980, you would have thought that they would have kicked on at the time, but it was a long 37-year gap there, and so there was that emotion to it there. So I suppose it just depends on where you sit, depending on who you supported for on the day there. I think most were probably more for Richmond's side there. Adelaide had actually changed the way they actually stood facing the opposition for the national anthem, and that came across as arrogant to some neutrals, and so most were probably on the side of Richmond there. For the first quarter, it actually looked like Adelaide were going to pull away there. There were a few mismatches which were concerning there. Rory Sloane was starting to get off the leash there. Dylan Grimes found himself on Eddie Betts, who's probably a little bit too quick for him there, and so it was a little bit of a mismatch there, but when it came to it, Richmond were just too hard the contest there. Guys like Trent Cotchin, Dustin Martin and Bashir Hooley all lifted. Grimes tightened up there on Eddie Betts there, and Jack Graham was the big surprise there. Not only kicked 3 goals, but did a fantastic job on Rory Sloane in the second half there, really curbed the influence there. And the last quarter was actually really something special there to watch. People on the sidelines like Brendan Gale, like Matthew Richardson, so involved with the club either through playing or administrative perspective there. Seeing the emotion from those guys, it was actually a little bit heart-touching there. So for 2 years in a row, we've got sides breaking premiership droughts there. The Melbourne or Saints fans, they can only touch wood to see if it's their turn.
Well, let's just touch on that for just a bit more, because obviously for the last 25 years there has been a dual personality to the AFL. On the one hand, it came from a sort of traditional club structure of the VFL, where there were a whole bunch of inner Melbourne clubs, and they were the ones who competed over it, and it was clubs. These were organisations that had roots in the particular geographical areas they came from. And then on the other hand, we have the national corporate franchise idea of the AFL, where you're about trying to get supporters wherever they are across the country. It's about being mobile, about shifting from area to area depending on where the money is and where the fans are, where the TV rights deals are. And that conflict has just been an underlying narrative throughout the AFL throughout the course of these last 25 years. And so it's been very interesting that we've seen both the Western Bulldogs and Richmond, which are the old-fashioned VFL clubs, win premierships, and it kind of reverts the idea that the AFL seem to have, which that they want to see GWS and Gold Coast and probably Adelaide and Sydney to be the ones who win the premierships. So if St Kilda or North Melbourne or someone like that wins the next premiership, then it'll just give more material to the narrative that the old-fashioned inner Melbourne clubs who originate from the VFL are not a dying species, they're not dinosaurs, they still have a role to play in the AFL going forward.
For these clubs, I think you can find enough motivation from within those supporters that you talk about there. All it takes is just going to training and seeing the diehard supporters who you see every week there at, say, Punt Road at 7 a.m. there for an early morning session there of training there, seeing however many hundred people go there, to then the extreme of going to Grand Final Day where they actually had to lock out fans because there were so many there. You could sell out Punt Road there if you really wanted to for the final training session there. So it doesn't take much to get motivated from the fans' perspective there. And it would probably go the same for some of the interstate clubs there. I mean, we're talking about, for example, West Coast, who have been to competition near enough 30 years there, and so a lot of them have their own history with that as well there. Not so much someone like a West Sydney or a Gold Coast there, who probably don't have the history just yet. But yeah, it definitely helps having those supporters who have been around for a long time, ones who can remember the last premiership, remember how it feels for them, and be able to have that feeling again there. It obviously means a lot to supporters and therefore for the players as well.
Alright, so now let's take a break, and when we come back we've got more to discuss. You are listening to Selling the Dummy on Bizz 99.9 FM Substitute Radio. and welcome back. You're listening to Selling the Dummy on Bizz 99.9 FM Substitute Radio. I am Chukka Wilson and I'm joined by Shane Scooter Coots, and we are discussing the changes that have happened with the AFL over the course of the 2017-18 summer, with the 2018 home and away season just around the corner. So Scooter, we're now time to talk about the major personnel changes that happened in the draft, which happened in November 2017. And so we're going to just talk about what you think of these changes. Were they the right moves to make for each of these clubs and each of these players? So let's start with Jackson Trengrove, who has moved from Port Adelaide to the Western Bulldogs.
This was an interesting one. The thing with Jackson is that he wasn't necessarily totally on the outer of the Port Adelaide first team. One of the things that worked against him for staying at Port Adelaide was the emergence of some of the other key defenders there, even key forwards there. Todd Marshall's one man that comes to mind there. You still have Justin Westhoff playing really good football. Charlie Dixon, who was recruited to the club to be that key forward there. And of course, Paddy Ryder in the ruck there. So all of the bits and pieces that Trengrove could fill was actually being filled by someone else there. And so he actually had a decision to make to either ride it out with Port Adelaide there or seek further opportunities there. And going to the Western Bulldogs wasn't necessarily a huge drop there. While Port Adelaide made finals and the Bulldogs didn't, the Bulldogs have still got the core of that 2016 group there. So it wasn't necessarily the big backwards jump there. So a no-brainer from that perspective. Trengrove will certainly get a game in the best 22 for the Bulldogs and could fill a number of roles there. But from his perspective, at least he knows he's going to play week to week, and sometimes that's all a player needs. So no surprise as a free agent he made that change.
Next we have Tom Rockcliffe, who has moved from the Brisbane Lions to Port Adelaide.
Most consider this probably the biggest win-win of the free agency. When it comes to Tom there, he's probably a bit too old to be part of the next core Brisbane group to win a premiership there. That's commonly considered there amongst the pundits there. And so, from his perspective, he also has to make a decision there. He can either ride it out with Brisbane there and perhaps miss out on anything, on any silverware there, or at least go for it and go to Port Adelaide there, who are definitely in that, probably the best 5 teams in the competition leading into the season coming up there. So, it was definitely a win as well for Brisbane there with the first round compensation pick. What it means is that they can actually build again from the back half and go back to the national draft and look at that, or at least have the pick available to make a trade for a player there. And we'll talk more about their trades just a little bit later on there. But this was definitely the big win-win. I think both clubs and Tom would be happy with the move.
Next we have Steve Motlop, who has moved from Geelong again to Port Adelaide.
This is actually a long time coming, Motlop moving from Geelong there. I'm trying to figure out the last off-season which actually had Steve Motlop not moving there. It was talked about from year after year. Constantly it was about Motlop being a required player down at the Cattery there, and this was backed up by Chris Scott when he was on regular football programs there, and it didn't actually seem like for a while that all of it was actually going to lead into a change there. And for some players that ends up being the case, that it just remains being at the current club there. But eventually Port Adelaide got the deal done there as a restricted agent to recruit Motlop there, and so this is a big one for Port Adelaide. Geelong won't necessarily be that unhappy. There were a lot of games that Motlop played where he didn't quite have the influence, the one exception when he played well against Richmond down at Geelong. But I think the change can be good for Motlop. Just depends on whether Geelong can actually make the most of that spot in the side for someone else coming in.
Next we have Trent McKenzie, who has moved from the Gold Coast to Port Adelaide.
Another one of those recruits there for Port Adelaide there. With McKenzie there, his time was up at Gold Coast. I think that was commonly accepted there from everyone, especially Trent, because he obviously made the choice there to change. And Port Adelaide seems to be the right fit for him there. They've got a lot of those in and under midfielders there. You think of the likes of Ollie Wines, you think of the likes of Travis Boak there, to a lesser extent even Robbie Gray when he's not playing forward there. So to have someone on the outside who's got that long kicking left foot there, I think actually suits Port Adelaide really well there. So while Gold Coast were on the back half and McKenzie wasn't getting a game, going to Port Adelaide may even result in him being in the best team, or at least in the best 25 there, be on the emergency list there. So a really good one for McKenzie to get a fresh start. As for Gold Coast, they've got a young group coming through, so they probably don't need players necessarily in Trent's age group there. They can get players from the national draft at 18, 19 years old and start developing them.
And next we have Jake Lever, who is moving from Adelaide to Melbourne.
This is part of the new go home factor, which we're actually starting to see with trades there, where players request to go back to their home state. And for Jake's sake, he's only 21 and yet has requested to come back and play in Melbourne there. So it's starting to become more common, probably going to be more likely considering we've got the relaxation of some of the free agency rules there. We're probably going to see it more and more as the year goes on there. So what clubs are doing is they're doing their best to to make it work so that everyone's happy. Obviously, with both Adelaide and Melbourne, and also Jake being happy there. And I think they got as close as they could. I think, considering how young Jake is, his value is much greater than someone who would be, say, 25, 26, and you can only get, say, 6 years out of him there. So it wasn't surprising that the 2 first-round picks is what Adelaide got for him there. Gives them a bit of firepower to recruit someone themselves, such as a Bryce Gibbs, which they ended up doing there. So it ended up working for all parties concerned. The only one who has the question mark probably at this point is Melbourne, whether they can actually get the value from Jake.
And next we have Jake Stringer, who has been moved from the Western Bulldogs to Essendon.
Yeah, this is the interesting one there. Jake was actually probably in a similar situation to a man we talked about previously there in Steve Motlop there, where he actually had multiple conversations about whether he was actually going to stay at the club there, and again, the same sort of wording back saying he's a required play there. And for a long time, it actually didn't look like it was actually going to happen there. The thing with Essendon is that they actually went hard at the trade period and recruited Adam Sard as well as Devon Smith there, and so they didn't necessarily have the currency that looked that appetising to get a player like Stringer, who was an All-Australian at such a young age there, and a high draft pick as well there. So it wasn't necessarily that obvious. The fact that they've accepted 2 second-round picks makes me think that there's a reason why the Bulldogs got rid of him there. We'll soon see, of course. At the end of the day, we won't actually know the true value, probably for 10 years when these draft picks start looking into their retirement years there. You'll probably get a true gauge of whether it was actually a worthwhile trade for Essendon to actually go and get Stringer. But of course, if Essendon win a premiership with Stringer, then you can just about put the line through it. It's a great decision there from the Bombers.
Next we have Charlie Cameron, who is moving from Adelaide to Brisbane.
Yeah, this is another one of the go-home factor there. Charlie almost being a cusp of a premiership player there, be it that last day in September last year there, making the change to actually go to Brisbane. He's probably in the right age bracket to make this work in terms of actually winning a premiership up there. He's only 23, so that's fine from that perspective there. Adelaide will be really disappointed though when they have someone like Eddie Betts who's in his 30s there. Charlie Cameron was that next up-and-coming small forward, commanded his spot in the best 22 there, and was really the one coming through to replace Eddie as the key small forward there. So Adelaide are going to have to find a way to get their goals from their small forwards aside from Eddie Betts moving forward there now that they don't have Cameron. For Brisbane it works really well, considering that they lost Josh Shackey. They needed probably a bit more goal-kicking power up forward there. I know they're different sort of height players and different types of players there, but they needed someone else to kick goals there for them there, along with Eric Hipwood. So Cameron was a great recruit from Brisbane. Right age bracket, right ability there. He was part of a team that's played finals, so he brings that finals experience there. They've also brought in Luke Hodge with that same amount, so it's a great win for Brisbane. It's a bit of a wait and see from Adelaide there.
And finally, we come to the most reported and the most bizarre change that we've seen over the course of the summer, which is Gary Ablett moving from the Gold Coast to Geelong. Now, this doesn't seem like a very logical one for Geelong, because Gary Ablett is quite an old player as far as AFL players are concerned. He would only have 1 or maybe 2 years left in him, and apart from the sentimental factor that it would be nice for the son of Gary Ablett to end his career at Geelong, so apart from the sentimental factor, this seems like a very illogical move. And as far as Gold Coast are concerned, I can imagine that they would be very happy to get rid of him so that they can bring in some new young players, but as far as Geelong is concerned, I don't understand it.
For Gold Coast perspective, they just need a new identity. For a long time it used to be about Gary Ablett. Remember, he won a Best and Fairest there with missing so many games in that particular year, and so it was all about Gary. When Gary didn't play, it was looking at the win-loss record when he wasn't playing compared with when he was playing, the fact that Gary missed so many away games, played the home games. From Gold Coast perspective, they need a new identity. So the fact that not only were they able to bring in Stuart Dew as a new coach there, but able to work out a very, very good trade from their perspective. They're getting a second-round pick for someone who's 34. That's amazing from Gold Coast perspective there. They can rebuild from that. Second-round pick may not necessarily be a star, but that's someone who can play at the club for 10 years there. And Gary may have retired if he didn't get the trade back to Geelong there. So it's looking at 10 years as opposed to potentially 0, maybe 1. So it's a fantastic deal for Gold Coast. For Geelong, this again only works really if they win a premiership there, similar to the one we talked about with Jake Stringer earlier there. It seems like they've paid overs, but again, if they win a premiership, that's okay. It's generally all forgiven there. So it's another wait and see, but it could be really soon. We can say to Gold Coast, this is a big win for you guys.
Alright, so now let's take a break. You're listening to Selling the Dummy on Bizz 99.9 FM Substitute Radio. I'm Chukka Wilson, and I'm joined by football expert Shane Scooter Coots. We'll be back after this break with more discussion. And welcome back. You're listening to Selling the Dummy on Bizz 99.9 FM Substitute Radio. I'm Chukka Wilson, and I'm joined by Shane Scooter Coots. So, the 2017-18 summer saw witness to the inaugural AFLX competition, taking place over the 15th, 16th and 17th of February. The 18 AFL teams were participating. They were divided into 3 groups of 6, and each of those were divided into 2 pools of 3. There was then a set of round-robin games inside of each pool, where the 3 teams played each other once, which means that everyone played 2 games, and the winner from the 2 pools then went to play each other in that group grand final. So we ended up with the 3 group grand finals and the 3 group premiers, which were Adelaide, Melbourne and the Brisbane Lions. So let's start off, Shane Scooter Coots, with the obvious question: what is AFLX?
Well, in terms of where it needs to sit in the game there, considering that it's something the AFL want to persist with there, it's going to be trying to compete with 2020 there. I know we'll probably delve into that a little bit more a bit later on there, but while AFL doesn't necessarily have the same problems as other sports do, because the length of the game suits most people, the fact that it's 2 hours of playing time, there's half hour or so of breaks there, most people are really happy with that. You can start games 10 past 1 in the afternoon, you can start games at 28 at night, and never really finishes too late, so it's generally okay there. So AFL has a good amount of time that they play there, but some people want things quicker there. That's just trying to expand to a greater audience there. They want to make sure they appeal to as many people as possible there, and so there are some people who can't sit through 2.5 hours of sport there. They need something quicker, need something shorter there. So AFLX gives the option of that. So it can have a place, and we'll talk more about where it can sit in the overall scheme of things as the program moves on there. But in terms of that, it's just meant to be quick fire, less contact, quicker, and try and get more fans involved who don't want to sit through a full 2.5 hours.
So can you explain to me the rules about how does AFLX actually work, in so that we can compare it with ordinary AFL football?
Well, in terms of where it's different there to normal AFL football, firstly, less players on the field there and a smaller field there. So imagine a typical soccer ground. So for example, there was one of the groups there was played in Adelaide, played at the Hindmarsh Stadium, home of Adelaide United A-League club. So you can play on a standard soccer field there. That's generally how big you want it there, and less players on the field there. How it generally works out is that you have less tackling, even though tackling's still part of the game. The reason being is that the players per square metre is there's more room on the field, and the skills themselves are obviously still quite high because they're AFL players. Of course, the skills can be quite high, and there's a lot more room to hit your targets there. So think of it like an AFL game with less tackling. Not quite so much that it makes it less of a spectacle there, because there is still tackling there. That's still a part of it. And the other thing as well to keep in mind is that there has to be one player in each forward 40 metre arc. So it's not so much AFL where everyone can push up the ground there, leave a big hole down the field there. This is more for having one player stay at home, having a bit more room in the midfield there, and of course one player has to be in your back line against the opposition's forward.
So for those of us who have just been watching the news and reading the newspapers, it seems as though AFLX came out of nowhere. Was there a long period of preparation by the AFL before they actually launched this? Because when I think of when they decided to introduce GWS and Gold Coast in the AFL, there were mutterings and rumours going around for 3 or 4 years before the actual plan went into action. But it seems like AFLX almost came out of nowhere.
It didn't necessarily need as much playing there. This is something that you can use in pre-existing soccer fields there to make work there. So it didn't actually need necessarily that much amount of time there. You could get this done quite quickly there. All you need to do is tell ground staff that you want to play a game at their ground, make sure you reserve the day there, get tickets out, get people excited about actually wanting to come to the games there, and getting them there, and making sure that the clubs understand the rules so they can actually plan accordingly. What's actually going to be their best team to take the field there. So you're right, it was quicker, and probably because they could afford it to be a lot quicker there as well.
And what were the official explanations from the AFL hierarchy about why the AFLX was introduced, and why was it now introduced rather than 2 years ago or 2 years hence?
It's moved the game forward there. One of the things that Gil has wanted to do is make sure the game keeps moving forward there. It's one of the big challenges as a CEO, because there's there's the old philosophy of it ain't broke, don't fix it. And the AFL is fine, and I think that's something we've talked about already in the show there. This is to make sure that we don't fall behind there, because we've seen how 2020's worked for cricket there. 2020 is now the more higher attendance part of the sport, and so the AFL doesn't want to miss the opportunity to have the equivalent there. And AFLX, in terms of where it can go from here, could be all sorts of directions there. It could be that it's something played at local levels. Because it's a smaller field, you could perhaps be less fit and play this version of football, as opposed to needing to be fit enough to play the full-size version there. So it may be better suited for the older players who can't afford to be tackled much more. It could be for the less fit players as well there. It could just be for the player who is a long shot at goal there, because one of the key rules there is that if you kick a goal from outside the 40-metre arc, it's 10 points. And so with that in mind there's different players who maybe not necessarily suited to the full game who can be suited to this game there. So it was about taking the advantage of the thought process and opportunity, and of course finding out if it works nice and soon there. The last thing AFL wanted to do is hold off on it, find out fans don't like it, and they're actually going to have less time to come up with their next big idea.
A bit earlier you mentioned the spatial dimensions of AFLX. The rules are mostly the same, but it is a difference between the number of players on the field and the size of the ground, which means of course that player per square metre is much lower. And of course that makes it immediately comparable to something like rugby sevens, which is another football code where you have less players, and that of course means that the actual dynamics of the sport are very different, because obviously football sports are essentially bodies moving around in an enclosed space, and they're trying to get the ball, trying to move the ball, trying to score, which means that like rugby sevens versus normal rugby league and union, it's going to be a very, very different style of play, different brand of football. It's going to essentially be completely its own character, which is different from 2020 cricket, because all the fundamentals are still there, just in a much enclosed area of time, which is why 2020 cricket is simply one-day cricket with a bit more intensity, less time for preparation. So that would mean that AFLX should be looking to rugby sevens for something comparable, not 2020 cricket.
Yeah, it's best comparison to go to something like rugby sevens there. I suppose when it comes down to the comparison with 2020 cricket there, it's because it's the second most popular sport in Australia, behind AFL. And so you generally look to your most direct competition there to ideas and to make sure you don't fall behind there. And it's one of the things AFL's done really well over their time there. So you're exactly right there. It's probably the closest to rugby sevens there. And that's where it appeals to sort of a different fan base there, whereby you find the people who are willing to watch something like rugby sevens there, who want something a bit quicker there, want to see more scoring opportunities. They'll probably be more interested in AFLX there. And it also then expands then to the world game. So rugby sevens can appeal to other countries there, whereby instead of having the problems with rugby, which is that you generally find your New Zealanders, your South Africans and your Australians, who are quite strongly built, are the best teams year after year, you can have different sort of players for rugby sevens, your quicker players, your smarter players in terms of holding your width. And this can be the same for AFLX there. You've got more room in terms of per square metre, like we've talked about a couple of times there. So you can have different sort of players, more clever players with that perspective there, rather than having just to be so strong, having to do hours of work in the gym there just to be strong enough to actually compete with the stronger bodies there. So it's going to appeal to different players, and it could actually lead to maybe even one day the Olympics, because it's just that different sort of game there.
What are your opinions of the branding that the AFL has done towards AFLX? Because there is a very difficult balancing act that all competitions have to do when they're a subsidiary of another competition, which is that on the one hand you need to be independent, but on the other hand you need to connect with the motherboard. So the AFLX had its own logo or colouring, there was its own merchandise, so it was in its own alternative brand that was an icon that you could see and you could feel and you could touch, but it was very clearly tethered to the AFL, and so it never felt like it was its own independent thing, as opposed to something like 2020 cricket, the Big Bash League. Now the Big Bash League is so separate from the Sheffield Shield that you would essentially consider them to be separate, independent, autonomous entities. And Rugby 7 is much more linked with the established rugby institutions that you just can't consider it an autonomous entity. And so the AFL seems to be following much more the Rugby 7 model of what the branding should be, rather than the Big Bash League.
It may not even be forever as well there. You're exactly right where it stands right at the moment there. It is probably a bit closer to rugby sevens. But who's to say the next up-and-coming group juniors who may not necessarily be up the cup to AFL, maybe they're too short or maybe they're too slow. What if they start developing themselves for AFLX and become AFLX specialists there? There could be room for an AFL competition where some of the better players rest and they recruit AFLX specialists there, have a different squad for AFLX. Because at the end of the day, if it's similar to how it is at the moment playing one day there, you may not even want to play many of your AFL players. You may only want to play your draftees or your trade players. So you may get these AFLX specialists who have trained their whole lives to play AFLX in 10 years' time. So they start developing right now when they're like 11, 12. They're ready by the time they're 22. They're going to be the AFLX stars. So they could be ready just to be those effectively free agents to be ready for that. So it's different directions that it could take there. I suppose because it's so new, right now it just needs to be something that the fans enjoy watching, because if they're not going to watch it next year, then they might scrap it. And then there's no point in developing these players to be that sort of style there. So right now it's close to one direction, the more the rugby style, but it's got room to move.
So right now, the AFL preseason competition is essentially just a warm-up for the AFL. So all the players that are going to be playing in the AFL home and away season are getting ready to play, and depending on whether they need game experience, they'll either play in the preseason competition or they might need to physically rest up and they don't want to risk injury, in which case they won't play in the AFL preseason. So if AFLX is going to be evolving into its own idea and its own identity, its own style of play, and it's going to be separate, it'll eventually reach the point, like you say just a second ago, that we would see AFLX specialists, in which case the entire nature of how players move up through junior football into other representative forms of the game actually start to become distinct and separate. And so, for example, we think about AFLX being much less contact, much more skill-based, in which case you don't actually need to worry about, one, the physicality of trying to tackle someone, two, the immediate agility of trying to dodge a tackle. So, first of all, building up intense muscle is less important. Second of all, building up immediate agility to move off the balls of your feet don't matter as much, and much more accurate kicking is much more important, and also jogging around the field. So in that case, the entire way that you would train up an AFLX footballer would be so distinct that you would see an evolutionary divergence. So on the one hand, you would see AFL footballers in their traditional, the way that they get trained and built up, and then AFLX footballers are so different that they would almost be distinct, separate species.
You're exactly right there, and I'm going to give you two examples of how it could vary. The first example I'm going to use is Chris Judd. Now, Chris Judd retired at 32 years old and had some poor shoulders for a long time there, and so he wasn't ready to go for another AFL season. That was commonly accepted. Chris accepted it, the Carlton Football Club accepted it, the Carlton fans accepted it. But imagine if he can come back and play AFLX, where he's less likely to get damage to his shoulders there. You could get 2 years out of him as just an AFLX player. So what you might do is, say, the Carlton Football Club, let's say they recruit Chris Judd as an AFLX player. They keep in touch with him until, say, October, train him as an AFLX player from October to January. February he plays all the games, and then does whatever he needs to do for the rest of his year. So you could have a player like that, so a player extending his career. But let's then turn it the other way. Let's just say you have, say, a couple of good players from, say, MacLeod in the Northern Football League. Let's just say they're not going to make AFL because they're too skinny, or there's something that it doesn't quite match up with the normal AFL. What they could have is something similar to the AFLW, where the player goes and plays for Carlton in the AFLX, goes back to then plays MacLeod for the Northern Football League, has an off-season, maybe he even does his pre-season with Carlton, doing the AFLX style, and comes back to MacLeod and plays for there. So there's so many directions you could take with it there, and it might not working that way. Just depends on how players want to develop themselves, what they go for, what they don't go for. So the doors are open. It just depends on whether the fans actually want to watch it.
Okay, and just finally, now the inaugural season of the AFLX only took place over 3 days, so it started and it ended with a blink of an eye. And have there been mumblings or rumours around the AFL about what their plans are for next season? Would they try and shift the dates or expand it, or just try and repeat what they did this year?
Nothing locked in as of yet there, nothing that jumps to mind or it's worth mentioning there. One of the things that come away from it from a fan's perspective there is the bittersweet nature of having 3 premiers. Generally what you would find is that you've got the old system, the pre-season cup, having a winner before the new JLT system didn't have a winner, and the AFL competition you had 2 clear premiers, pre-season premier, regular season premier. There was nothing bittersweet about it. You were either the winner or you weren't. concerned. For Adelaide, for Melbourne and for Brisbane, they can all claim their rights to premierships. So then what you do is you start poking at holes at, well, these teams didn't play so well. If you were Brisbane, you play against a Bulldogs team who aren't as strong. So you then try and downplay their premiership. And you might talk up, say, Melbourne's premiership there because of the fact that they were against a lot of clubs playing in their home state there. But then you look at Adelaide because they were the first teams to play there, so they didn't have anyone to watch on TV prior to playing. And you might then try and talk up their premiership there. And those sort of discussions are actually really poor to have because it sort of downplays each premiership. Well, all the teams on the day were the best team. So if they can eliminate that somehow, and it's going to be really hard to do, what it might end up doing is having to have, say, a Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And on the Sunday, what you have is you have those three teams who win those small grand finals. So what you end up having is you could have, say, the Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, you have the same system, and the Sunday, they all meet at one place and play those final games to decide the overall premier there. So that's an option for them. Again, nothing locked in yet, so we'll have to wait and see.
Well, here's something. The thing is that there are 18 AFL teams, and 18 is a very bad number because it doesn't divide very well, while 16 and 20 do divide very well. So if you had a couple of extra teams added to the competition, for example, a Hobart team and something else, then you could have 20 teams in the competition divided by 4. Each division has 5, and then they play against each other, and then you have a semi-final structure to find a singular AFLX premiership. That could be an option. Or cut down 2 of them, just have 16 teams, 16 divided by 4 is 4, and it also adds up very nicely.
Well, that was one of the advantages the old pre-season competitions have when there were only 16 teams in the AFL, is that they played each week, 16 became 8, 8 became 4, 4 became 2, 2 becomes 1. Works perfectly. No one has to make it complicated, it just works there. Having 20 teams could eventually work, but probably not in the more immediate future there. It's probably going to be something that's a 10-year plan. So for example, let's use the players we talked about before. Say you play for MacLeod in the Northern Football League. You might be signed for Hobart as a free agent there, play AFLX in Hobart, come back to MacLeod and play there, and then you could do that all across for the extra team as well there. So you have a Northern Territory team who would probably be the best suited considering they play football all year round up there. Or you look to another area. So it can work with 20, but it can't work in the immediate future there because what you'll end up finding is that right now, Hobart and this other team, the 20th team, would probably struggle. They'd probably lose every game. They wouldn't be competitive. So it has to be a 10-year plan to go, okay, how are these two teams going to be competitive? How are they going to be relevant there to such a short amount of time because they're going to have a fan base as well there. So can you support a team that only plays one day across a whole 365 days? So you'll need a lot of playing to have 20 teams.
Alright, so that's our discussion of the AFLX. Thank you very much for that, Shane Scooter Coots. We're going to be taking a break now. You're listening to Selling the Dummy on Bizz 99.9 FM Substitute Radio. I'm Chukka Wilson.
Come on.
And welcome back. You're listening to Selling the Dummy, the AFL discussion show on Bizz 99.9 FM Substitute Radio. I'm Chukka Wilson and I'm joined by Shane Scooter Coots. Now, we are about to talk about the AFL preseason. So let's just start with the off-field stuff, Scooter. Now, the AFL preseason has been reduced in size slightly in order to make room for the AFLX, and also not only in comparison to the previous previous seasons, the competition is going for a shorter span of time, but also there are fewer games. So teams are no longer playing 3 games, but just 2 games. And so it seems as though, as far as the amount of football is concerned, the AFL pre-season is far less substantive and important and given enough space to actually do things.
Most people consider the 2 games to be enough there for a lot of reasons there. And I suppose really the main reason for that being is that they will end up resting one of them anyway. If you are playing 3 games, you end up resting 1. You would find it hard to believe too many players would be in that 3 out of 3 game basket there. This is also across all levels of football, even the local levels. They'll fixture 3, but they'll look towards resting players for one of them there. So it's no surprise that it got shortened there. With the games, they still went to the rural areas, which was fantastic there. And I don't think they need to do it for 3 weeks, considering that you've got 18 games across the 2 weeks there. You can go to 18 different parts of Australia and playing these games and reaching out to the fans there. You cover across a good portion of our country here. So you don't necessarily need to do that for 27 games because you can achieve a lot of it for 18 games. So for example, this year you might go to Moe and Wangaratta, but next time you might go to 2 other towns there with fantastic local grounds there. So you can make it work with just the 2 games. It doesn't necessarily need to be 3. So it's a no-brainer they're meeting down to 2.
It also appears that the AFL have been moving away from the idea of seeing the AFL pre-season as a noteworthy and important competition in and of itself, compared with and separate to the AFL proper, as a pre-season competition that you can market and brand and get excited in its own right. With the elimination of group structures, of the grand final, of the any sense of being a winner of the competition, it just becomes a bunch of random round-robin games, which is comparable to the pre-season matches that we see in local football.
Well, exactly right there. The fact that they go out to these local grounds and play, it's almost the equivalent there. The only difference being is that they're the teams that you love watching on TV throughout the regular season there. That's all it is really different at the moment there, and fans I think can reach out to that. With the actual previous structure there of having a pre-season competition, there was that sense of achievement with the grand final there, but it also gave probably a sense of false hope to some teams. Remember, infamously, it would have been back in 2005, Carlton won the pre-season competition and then finished last during the regular season there. So overall it was a little bit bittersweet there. While there was some silverware, it didn't necessarily mean a lot there. So fans didn't necessarily want that sort of situation to continue there. So again, one of those ones that wasn't overly surprising. One day they might go back to it, but I think considering there's not that round number of teams, not to have say 16 teams, we can divide it easily into 8, 4, 2, 1 to find out a winner. I think you have to do something different there, and having it like local football, I think that will work.
Okay, so now let's just talk about the on-field stuff, about what actually happened in the 2018 AFL pre-season competition. So, who were the biggest winners and losers? So, Richmond had a very good pre-season competition, as did Carlton, Melbourne and Sydney. So, Scooter, would you feel that they are the ones who have got the most form and momentum as we approach round 1 because they did so well in the pre-season competition?
Well, you're exactly right there. Whether it necessarily turns into your round 1, round 2, round 3 victories or not is yet to be seen, of course, but it certainly gives them the best opportunity to have that momentum like you speak of there. For Richmond, it was actually more important than what maybe previous premiers have gone through there. What they've got hanging over them, and it's nothing they've done wrong, it's just because of what happened to the Western Bulldogs the year before there, is they've got the sense of a potential hangover there. So what you find is that if you don't win these pre-season games, fans become worried about the hangover there, the murmurs come around, it could sink into the playing group. But if you win those games, it gives everyone the confidence again that it's going to be the same as next year, or at least the best opportunity to be that. So for Richmond, it was really important to win those games, and they were dominant, considering that how easily they won against North Melbourne there down at Icon Park. That was something else there, the way they dominated so much, and the fact they could rest players in the last quarter of that game there. They were fantastic there. Melbourne's another team that sort of jumped out there. You mentioned all 4 of those teams. Melbourne had the issue last year of missing out on the finals by such a small margin there. They were 7th going into the last round, and yet they end up finishing 9th. It's going to be big for them to make sure they actually started going into the right direction there, making themselves a really worthy top 8 team. And it all begins with winning games of football there, and they had an opportunity to win those games, and they did. So it was important for them to make sure they won those games as well. well. With Carlton, they're a young side, so obviously it helps the younger players get some confidence, get into that winning culture. And Sydney, well, I wouldn't be too worried if Sydney lost. I think they've got enough experienced players to work through that. But again, they've still got a reasonably young best 22, if you like, so it was good for them to win as well. So all up, probably those four sides would be very confident going to the opening rounds.
And on the flip side, there have been a few teams who have done very badly in the competition and seem to be out of sorts, losing both their games. So we have two of the teams that had the terrible time in the last season, the 2017 season, Brisbane and St Kilda, and then two surprises, we have North Melbourne and Geelong also having very bad pre-season competitions.
Yeah, it's an interesting one with those four teams. We'll start with Geelong. Geelong don't necessarily have the same preparation or the same look to pre-season games. One of the things that stands out for that is they don't even play in their jumpers. They play in sleeved tops there, which people would have seen over the pre-season there. So when you're not even playing in the same attire that you're doing for the regular season there, it's hard to necessarily be treating it the same there. And so I don't think Geelong would be too worried about losing those games there. North Melbourne were actually really poor for those two games there. They lost to Melbourne by about 8 goals there and Richmond by more than that. So they were actually probably the worst side in the opening games there, and they'll need to bounce back with winnable games towards the start of their season there. They leaked also a lot of goals there, so from their perspective, they're going to have to try and clog that up. St Kilda wouldn't be too worried. I think for them, a lot of it's going to be when the actual season starts there about how they can work without Nick Riewoldt. So the preseason gives you a look at that, but it doesn't give you the true feel because there are teams resting their key defenders, because key defenders in particular will play a lot of minutes of every game. They can't afford to rest them during the year, so they're not going to play necessarily during the preseason. So you're not going to get a true look of their forward structure until the regular season starts. As for Brisbane, well, a few new personnel. They've got no Rockcliffe this year. They've recruited Luke Hodge, recruited Charlie Cameron. A lot of it's all like new look. Also no Josh Shackey, so it's just about gelling for them. So they wouldn't be too worried. They'll still be confident they can rise up the ladder.
Thank you very much for that, Shane Scooter Coots. It's time to take a break now, and then we come back, we've got the wrap-up of Selling the Dummy. You're listening to Bizz 99.9 FM Substitute Radio. And welcome back. You're listening to Selling the Dummy, the AFL discussion show on Bizz 99.9 FM Substitute Radio. I am Chukka Wilson and I'm joined by Shane Scooter Coots. Now, there are just a couple of administrative matters for the AFL in this 2018 season that we have to go through, and the first one is a sort of announcement, sort of testing the ground, sort of thinking about it, where they've said they want to do something, but they haven't made it official official yet, which is the AFL have said that they want to expand the draft so that it goes over a longer period of time. It's more of a showy presentation. It's more something to pay attention to. So it seems to be like they've taken their cues from the NFL draft over in America, and therefore that they want to turn the AFL draft into something comparable or something like that.
Yeah, they've actually looked in two different directions there in terms of how they want to expand it there. The first of which being is that not to have it over the 2 weeks over the off season there, because there are some deals that are inevitable that just take too long, and there are some deals that don't actually get done because there's not enough time there. So for a couple of reasons, they actually want to have longer than what they actually do now. They actually want to look towards 4 weeks as opposed to 2 weeks. Whether that's going to work or not, it might take time to get used to there, but it certainly can there. And I suppose one of the things to think about there is that you've got players there who are inevitably going to move. It's going to happen one way or another. One of the ones that stood out there was Gary Ablett going to Geelong. That was going to happen one way or another, but it took so long because firstly there was chinks in terms of working out what the right deal was, and secondly there, because they actually had to take time still before they can even start getting the deals done there. You can't actually make the deals until the actual trade period starts there. So having more time for those deals would work better, but it would also take time for fans to start getting used to it there. They're on the constant there looking for the news every day there because you've got an opportunity for something to happen every day. But in a 4-week trade period, you actually might go 4 or 5 days without anything happening, and that's something fans are going to have to get used to there. There still will be the closing day deals of a frantic nature there, similar to soccer having the last day of trade deadlines. It's going to work exactly the same there, and that's not going to change, but they would have to get used to the fact that they might not necessarily have a lot of action there for those other parts. And the other one that I'll mention is also the mid-season. They're potentially looking towards a trade or a loan system similar to soccer there. However, players playing reserves for one team, but another team could use that player for the rest of the season there for one reason or another. They could look towards loaning him out there for a fee or looking at a trade even beforehand. It may have to be player for player. It could be a future picks. Not too sure how exactly that would work there, but it has worked in the past there for the early stages of the AFL there. So we'll have to wait and see, but they are looking into it definitely.
And the other thing that to be talking about is the fixture, which has been released and it's publicised. And so you've had a chance to look at the fixture. So Scooter, what are your thoughts on it? And do you feel like we can make some sort of predictions about who's likely going to get the most vantage over the fixture with this particular structure?
Yeah, exactly right there. What you look for there is as much as you can past trends, and you also look at teams that underachieve there, because if you underachieve for one season, you may get such a good draw that you can rise up the ladder quite quickly there. I'm going to give you two thoughts behind that. First one I'll give you is the 13th place. Now, we know Richmond finished 13th in 2016 and won the premiership. So what they actually had the advantage of, they had the advantage of having 3 other teams in that bottom 6 bracket, playing them twice. So what you found is that as they were trying to build towards locking that top 4 spot, they had some easier games. And so it just worked perfectly for them. It set themselves up. They're not going to have the same luxury this year there, but at least for their sake, they're at least going to have at least that platform there of the confidence from that easier fixture back in 2017 there. It's probably still going to have some form of flow-on effect. And the other one is probably the slightly underachieving side of things there. So think about a side like, say, Fremantle, who probably underachieved a lot last year there. They're again going to be in that bottom tier, playing more home games this year, because one of the things in the fixture is that Gold Coast can't play as many home games. So they've actually sold one of their home games to Fremantle. So Gold Coast will host Fremantle at the new Optus Stadium in Perth. So Fremantle get that extra home game there. Then they get the advantage of the easier draw, finishing that bottom tier. So they can actually rise up the ladder quite quickly there. So for Fremantle fans, that's going to be fantastic for them if that ends up being the truth there. So the fixture itself is really good. It's fair. It's giving the teams in the bottom 6 tiers as much chance to get back up the ladder as possible there. So we'll see if the trends continue. Can Collingwood take advantage of finishing 13th like Richmond did? And can Fremantle take advantage of the more home games and the easier draw this year?
And that's the end of the program. Thank you very much, Shane Scooter Coots, for your time coming in and talking to us.
Yeah, not a problem. Happy to be here.
This has been Selling the Dummy, the AFL discussion show on Bizz 99.9 FM Substitute Radio. I have been Chukka Wilson. We'll leave you with the wise words of Jonathan Brown. On the topic of night grand finals vis-a-vis day grand finals, he remarked that, quote, "It's basically the same, just darker." Goodbye.